to the Planting Wildflowers podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Leonardis. I'm an entrepreneur, wife, mom, and stepmom. I'm super interested in people and perspectives, and I love how a good conversation can leave you feeling empowered. Sometimes even pique your curiosity to learn and grow. Mostly, though, I love how really listening to one another opens up limitless opportunities for that beautiful sense of connection and community that we all love. Thanks for tuning in. Let's be inspired. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Planting Wildflowers podcast. I'm your host, Rebecca Leonardis. Today, it is me. No guests are with us today. Instead, I wanted to explore a topic with you that has been not only relevant in my own life, but something that I'm witnessing amongst friends and family members. And I just felt as though this were a topic that we could take a look at together today, perhaps learn something new together, or become inspired to take a new direction on how we approach the topic of grief. Grief is not something that any of us, I would say, enjoy talking about, but it's something that is a reality. And especially in the midst of a global pandemic, it is something that I really believe that we all need to explore, because it is critical that we move through the stages of grief. And if we can do that together and provide any element of ease to one another, or to even just a single person, then it's worth knowing that we can lighten the load for someone else. So I'm glad that you have clicked on this episode and that you're ready to give this a listen, because it's just something that is part of being human, and grief is a very natural process. And I've learned a lot. 2020 has been a year that we've all been talking about so much, and I think the biggest thing are all these lessons that are coming out of the year. All of us will have experienced 2020 in different ways, and to varying degrees. So please don't mistake any of what I'm about to offer to you as um, something that matches for everyone. In fact, I know that to not be true. I think perspective is everything. And of course, anything that I share with you today is going to be through my own personal lens. But I know this to be true as well, as sometimes listening in on someone else's perspective about something can offer you a new way of looking at a very familiar topic. So let's dive into this together. What I hope to be able to share with you today are just a few of the insights that I've gleaned in the past little while about grief. And then I want to offer you 8 very specific tips on how you can support someone who is experiencing grief. If it's you that is in the process of moving through the stages of grief, I would encourage you to certainly give some of these tips a listen, apply them in your own unique way to your own unique situation, and definitely understand this underlying point, whether you're supporting someone or whether that person is you, that grief is just a really natural element of living. So here is what I have learned in recent months about the topic of grief. Friends, I do know that specifically today, I'm going to be talking a lot about how grief relates to the loss of a loved one. Death and grief certainly go hand in hand with one another. But the key thing that I have learned recently is this: grief is not exclusive to the topic of death. In fact, grief is present in our lives more often than we've ever thought it to be. Here's what I mean by that. Grief is present in moments where we have perhaps lost a job. Maybe we have had a friendship dissolve or experienced a divorce. Any type of loss will trigger a grief response. And as such, it's really important to know that feeling the levels of grief and moving through those are really important. When you have an opportunity to bring emotion to the surface, that is the only place that it can really be dissolved. Feeling your emotions is something that we're not all eager to do. In fact, most of us would prefer, if we're being honest with ourselves, to run in the other direction, to suppress, suppress, suppress. And in fact, in most of our histories, maybe even your own personal history, one of the coping mechanisms that has been taught to us as a society is to handle grief by being strong, moving on, get yourself busy so that you can think about other things. This is not an uncommon approach to handling grief, but it is not an approach that allows for what we just talked about, and that is feeling all the feels, allowing those feelings to come to the surface so that they can be dissolved. So, right now, we are currently in a stage of we're under a stay-at-home order in the area where I live, which means that when a friend or a family member passes away, the typical grieving response or the typical way we support someone who is going through grief is to show up at a visitation, to provide our support in the physical sense, by being there with the person who is in the state of grief, by offering hugs, by dropping off that thoughtful token lasagna, right? We've all felt that pull to whip up a casserole or something along those lines that will help the person move through the grief that they're experiencing. We've always done this in the past in a real, literal, very physical sense. But that opportunity has been removed from us now. With this stay at home order, it has really restricted our ability to be with the people that we want to be with during this difficult time for them. And that has impact on both sides, both for the person in grief and the support person who has this element of feeling helpless at the fact that there isn't the opportunity to connect in the physical sense. So it's important that, we're just, the bottom line is we're just going to have to get creative about the ways we handle grief right now because it hasn't gone away. Before I get into those tips that I'm really looking forward to sharing with you, and guys, before I get into sharing tips with you, you've got to know this already. I am someone who, as a holistic health coach and someone who spends a lot of time in research mode, this is a subject I don't know an awful lot about. I'm just going to call it out. However, if experience is a source of, if you've experienced something, I think that makes you more of an expert in a lot of cases than the mechanical aspects or the research that goes into certain topics. You know what I mean? So, having experienced grief, and in particular the loss of someone very special to me in this past year, the loss was sudden. The loss was deep. It was tragic. I still have a really hard time wrapping my head around the fact that this person is no longer among us physically. I'm very aware of her presence in a number of other ways, but I was not able to experience that closure that often comes with visitations and funerals and all of those physical aspects of grieving, the way we talked about earlier on. And I think that lack of closure has left me in the stages of grief longer than what I might have been had I been given the opportunity for that closure. I hope that all makes sense. But what I'm getting at is I'm not an expert in the topic of grief. There are many amazing experts out there. In fact, one of my friends who is local. I'm going to put her information in the show notes. You guys will become familiar with her, if not already, from one of our podcast episodes. I will put her contact information because as a social worker, she really specializes in grief. She offers yoga for grief. And I think it's important for you, wherever you are in the world, to find experts, people who specialize in the topic of grief, to be able to move yourself through, because it is such a unique experience. But having said all that, I really feel as though the experience of grief at least gives you a benchmark for understanding, and at least gives you a benchmark for the level of compassion that you wish to extend to other people who are in a similar situation. Okay, so let me share with you just a bit of the research before I get into those 8 tips. Like I said, I'm no expert myself, but research and experience have put me in this position where I just want to share. I want to share what I've learned with you because it's helped me. And I know for someone listening right now that one of these topics or one of these resources will land on your lap, and you'll look into it and it will provide you with some sense of ease. And that's all I hope for. So I spent some time taking a look into a couple of the professionals that I think have done a tremendous job on providing tangible ways to understand the process of grief. Specifically, who I'm referring to is David Kessler, as well as Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, an MD. The two of them had the opportunity to partner on a couple of different books that you can access and that I will put in the show notes for you. But their work is really unique. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is the person who designed the 5 stages of dying. And this work with her and David Kessler is based off of that work, and they've adapted it to suit the 5 stages of grieving. Now, remember, before I share the 5 steps with you, grieving can come in the form of loss in lots of different ways. This doesn't necessarily have to be applied to the death or loss of a loved one. It can be applied to whatever you've experienced loss for. And again, David Kessler really emphasizes the fact that we can't heal what we don't feel. So the work in grief work, is an absolutely vital stage in helping heal yourself, but helping to remember loved ones. The more you remember them with love, and compared to the pain of the loss itself, it will actually shift your body. So as an approach to health and wellness, dealing with grief is a major component in helping you move through this phase of your own life. The first stage of grief is denial. I think we've all kind of heard this before, but let me just remind you that denial is really specifically, it's what helps us survive those early stages of loss. It's that stage where, if it's you or if you're recognizing this in another person, it's the stage where the world becomes meaningless. It can feel overwhelming. You're in a state of shock, and you can often describe it as feeling numb, or maybe you've heard someone feeling as though they're moving through life feeling numb or like they're a zombie. That is a very natural stage, and is the first stage in grief. And this denial stage is super important because it allows for us to pace the grief. Grief is a very overwhelming state, as I'm sure many of you listening can agree. Denial paces it in a way that you can handle it. Dig into the work of David Kessler to explore that specific mention, because I think it's really important to understand how grief begins and how you move into that second stage. Now, the second stage is anger. And anger is, again, all of these are very natural steps, but anger is an interesting one to me because The more you feel it, the more it will dissipate. Remember, we talked about the idea of bringing it to the surface so that it can be resolved. And anger it's an emotion that we all know. So think about that for a minute. You're going to feel angry at loss, but anger is a feeling that might linger a little bit because it is an emotion that you understand how anger feels in your body. And therefore, there might be this feeling of control in this stage of anger because you're familiar with what it's like to be angry. Anger is something that needs to be processed and needs to be moved through. The third stage of grief is bargaining. And this is that stage, if you haven't experienced it on a personal level, I have every reason to believe that there is someone in your life that you're connected to where you've witnessed this. You've heard the comments about what ifs. They've expressed regrets. And if I had only done this, or if I had only done that. Sometimes there's deal making that happens with the higher power. If the person is religious on any level, you may hear them bargaining with their higher power to just allow that person to live. And if they've already passed, continuing that bargaining phase, so that they can create this false impression in their mind that perhaps they can change it, that they'll wake up the next day, if they just do this, this, and this, and they commit to this higher power, that they'll wake up the next day and this will all have been just a bad dream. That's bargaining, the third stage of grief. Depression is what follows, and this is the stage that feels as though it can last forever. And depression will emerge when loss fully settles itself into your soul. So you've either felt this in every cell of your own body, or you've witnessed it take over for someone else. You've seen it actually happening, because once that permanence has occurred to the grieving individual, it dominates the way they function mentally and physically. Depression is something, like I said, that can feel like it's going on forever. Acceptance is a stage of relief. Yes, acceptance is when we know the truth. We know the truth that our loved one is physically gone, and we're recognizing now officially, like committing it to our body, committing it to our mind, committing it to our soul, that this is in fact permanent. Acceptance is, I said before, this almost a state of relief. It doesn't mean that there isn't pain associated with it. It just means that there is this forward movement into the next phase, which is something that, although we've talked about the 5 stages of grief, I love the fact that David Kessler, the author of many really, really intriguing pieces of work on the topic of grief, he's gone into this 6th stage that offers, to me, this one is punctuated with this idea or this feeling of hope. And the 6th stage is finding meaning in the loss. So this would be the stage where moving forward is done so in a way that honors the loss of a loved one. It honors the experience of any loss that you might have had, whether we're applying that to the topic of divorce or a friendship dissolving, the loss of a job, whatever the case may be. This is finding meaning in that experience. The bottom line is that grief is not something, even though you move through all 5 phases, it's not something that ever becomes smaller. In fact, grief is something that we as humans just simply grow around. Grief is not linear, meaning that even though we're moving through the phases, you would think that we were moving with forward trajectory and not looking over our shoulder at the last step, when reality is that you can move forward 2 steps and fall back 3. It is a literal roller coaster, and you will not have control over how those stages are experienced. There is also not a timeline associated to how long you should spend in each of these stages. So if it's you, give yourself the grace that is required to move through grief in a way that is appropriate for you. If you are supporting someone who is moving through those stages of grief, just know that your timeline has nothing to do with how quickly or how slowly they move through each of the stages of grieving. That's an important thing to recognize because, as I mentioned before, as a society, we have been encouraged to move on, get back to work, put our heads down and just get her done. When really the only way to dissolve the pain is to feel the pain. Now, I've come up with a few ideas, specifically ways that we can support people who are in that grief process. And this kind of came to me because I have really felt helpless. I had a loss of my own, I mentioned to you, in 2020 that really rocked me to my core, and continues to do so in different ways. However, I believe I've found the sixth stage of grieving, and that is finding meaning in the loss. Doesn't mean I don't revert back and really feel, especially the stage where we talk about the what ifs. I think a lot about the what ifs, and I think, if things had been different, would this have happened in the same way? So while I have found the sixth stage in finding meaning, it's worth me reminding you that this is a roller coaster, and it's very easy to revert back to any of those stages at in any given time. In fact, I heard David Kessler, the expert in grief, I heard him asked, how long should grief take? How long should I be in these stages? How long in total should I be, quote unquote, grieving? And his response was something that floored me because it's just so true. It's a little hard to hear, depending on where you're at. But his response was, how long do you expect for the person to be gone? So if you're grieving a death, how long do you expect for that person to be dead? And if the answer is for always, then you can equate that to your grieving process being equally as long. So keep that in mind. Let's move on to the 8 unique steps, 8 unique opportunities for supporting someone who is in this grieving process. The ideas are just really, they're here to kind of spark your caring heart into action. And you might have a whole list of other ideas, but if you're like a lot of people, grief can leave you stumped. You don't know what to say. It's hard to know what to do. That too is a very normal occurrence. So don't be too hard on yourself about that if you're trying to support someone in the grieving process, but don't know how to do it. It's hard. It's hard to watch somebody be sad. It's hard to know what to say or to do. So hopefully some of these tips will offer you a few ideas on how you can offer yourself in these difficult times. The first one would be to use your voice. So what I mean by that is, now more than ever, it's important for us to hear from one another. So while we cannot be together physically, the very least we can do is connect to one another through our voice. So if you're someone who is into texting, texting is one of the most popular ways for people to stay in touch these days. In fact, 90% of people who receive text messages will open them up and take some sort of action on them. And that's a higher percentage than any other way to reach people, whether it's a phone call or reaching them on social media. Text messaging is the proven way to connect directly with someone. So if you're taking the time to text a message to someone, can I invite you to look at the option on your phone? I think almost all of us must have this function at this point in time. There's a little microphone option that allows you to text the person, but to do it as a voice note. My recommendation is to go ahead and say what needs to be said in a voice recording. It not only captures your sentiment in the way you intend for it to be delivered, but it is just next level connection for the person who is receiving it. So use your voice is tip number one. The second tip is to send a digital card. So I know in this awkward time that we find ourselves in where we're not going to funerals, not going to visitations, not even popping over at the person's house to spend some quality time with them, you want them to know that they're in your thoughts. And sending a message in the mail, a card, the traditional card that we would send out at the loss of someone, is not going to reach them in the early phases following that person's death. So a digital card offers a solution to that. And if you're not familiar with these, I would encourage you to check out a couple of my favorite. One of them is Punchbowl. The other one is called Evite. So Evite. Both of these platforms are so cool because it's like standing at in a Hallmark store or in the pharmacy in the card section and having this whole wall of options in front of you. You pick the card, you can customize it, and you can email it to the recipient so that, or you can text it actually too. Both of those platforms offer you a texting option as well as an email option. So in my opinion, this is a really, really nice way to make sure the person knows that you're thinking of them in the immediate days or moments following the loss of someone. What's really cool right now, and depending on when you're listening to this, I hope this is still true for you. Punchbowl and Evite are both offering free digital cards right now. So the idea is that these companies recognize that connection is key and want you to stay in touch with your loved ones. So now there is this unique opportunity that you can send your sentiments without needing to pay for the card itself. So do give that some consideration. So tip number 2, send a digital card. Number 3 tip is make music your gift. So music, at least for myself, has always been an anchor for beautiful, beautiful memories. Music often captures our emotions in a way that our words sometimes cannot. And if the deceased person is someone that you knew personally, select a song that reminds you of that person and share it with the family. That is a real treasure, and I know holds so much meaning to the people who are receiving it. Explain to the family why that particular song or passage, whatever the case may be, explain why it has relevance to you. Families love to uncover, these more minor details or inner workings, I should say, of their loved one. And if you're not familiar with the deceased, just select a song that's always given you a sense of peace in times when you've needed it. Your message to the family can express why you've chosen the song. And there's a lot of ways you can do this. If you're wondering how, you can pick a song on Spotify, on YouTube, on Google, on Apple Music, and you just share the link to that song, text it to the person, email it to the person, along with a message. Maybe pair this music as a gift, pair it up with a voice note. What a beautiful way to acknowledge someone's loss. And it really shows that, there's just this incredibly thoughtful element to the fact that you searched for something that had such personal meaning. The 4th tip I have for you is this: dig up the photos. If you're someone who has ever lost anyone, you know this. You know that looking at old photos is such a healing way for families to unite and to reminisce. So if you have access to photos of the person that's been lost, Now would be the time for you to share them, and you can reveal stories that might be unknown to the family. Offering this often will bring new laughs, and it helps complete the picture of the loved one's life. Don't hesitate on doing this. Now is the time to share these more intimate details of the person that they've lost. And in sharing, it is a beautiful healing tool for you as well, particularly if the person you're sharing photos of was close to you as well. So the fourth tip, dig up the photos. Fifth tip, use the online condolences book. These have been around for a little bit now, but I hope you haven't had to fill many of them in. Um, Take a look at these books. They offer such a nice opportunity for you to add a comment, leave your sentiments in a collection that the funeral home typically collates together and provides for the family so that they have an opportunity to look back on all the beautiful messages. So tip number 5, use the online condolences book. Tip number 6, okay, this one goes back to that urge that we all seem to have to feed the grieving family. I mentioned before, kind of lovingly or jokingly, about the token lasagna or the token casserole. We do this because food has always been an expression of love. Food is nurturing, and it represents the way we want the recipient to feel. We want them to feel comforted. We want them to feel nurtured. We want them to feel loved. And sometimes the tradition can be a little bit overdone. Even though it's really well intended, it sometimes, maybe even now more so, it doesn't measure up to the practical purpose, especially, like I said, during the pandemic, because there aren't large groups of people together. There aren't housefuls of people to feed at this point in time. So something that I would recommend, something that you could look into, is an deliver to home food source. So specifically, grocery is always a great option because chances are, in a state of grief, shopping for groceries is not a high priority. And even more so because the house won't be filled with people, there would be less of an inclination to go out and get good quality food to take care of yourself during a grieving period. So a grocery order of any kind would be amazing. But specifically, sending something that points to self-care. In my area, I'm really lucky to have a company called On the Move Organics. If you're anywhere near London, Ontario, you'd need to look these guys up. This is an organic food delivery system where you can customize your cart, and week to week, you have food delivered to your home. You can also purchase gift cards or create a box or a delivery and have it delivered to someone. You pay for it and it gets delivered to their home. I just think to myself, what a great way in a challenging time, a great way to express that you're thinking of someone and encouraging them to keep their own self-care as a high priority. There's also another great company that does like pre-made meals. So same idea, organic foods. It's called Mama Earth Organics. And what's great about this is that the meal itself is already prepared, and it too is something that can be delivered. So if you're listening from anywhere outside of Ontario, you're just going to want to look up what options are available in your immediate area, and think of those. Think of those as a great expression of your love when you're supporting someone who is in that grieving process. So that was tip number 6, is feed them. Tip number 7, calendarize connection. What the heck do I mean by calendarize connection? So what I mean by that is grief can be especially intense immediately following the loss of a loved one. We talked about that, especially during the 5 stages of grief. Chances are they might even be in that denial phase. They may be feeling anger. Perhaps they're at the bargaining phase. It's going to be really important to note that if ever there were a time where more family than usual were able to be together, it would be in the days immediately following loss. But what happens is life needs to return to normal. People need to get back to work. People need to get back to school. And the person in that grieving phase is now feeling somewhat alone. So what I mean by calendarized connection is put it in your calendar, literally. If you're a paper and pen person, write it in your calendar. If you're someone who uses the digital format like a Google Calendar, an iCal, put it in your calendar to connect with that person and let them know quite simply that you're thinking about them, that they haven't left your mind. And if they're able to chat, you're there for them. A listening ear is oftentimes the main thing that people need in this time of grief. And that said, keeping it simple is the most appropriate in my, again, I'm not the expert, but based on experiences and having witnessed other people in this stage of grief, I know that keeping it simple is the very best thing that can be done for both the giver and the receiver of support. So we often overthink what needs to be said in a time of grief. Allowing someone to know that you're keeping them in your thoughts can really be so simple. It could sound like, my heart goes out to you, or I'm here. I share your pain. I hurt with you. No overthinking is necessary. It's the effort to connect that's important, not the word you choose. No one's really going to remember the words that you use, but they're always going to remember the way you made them feel. So consider, if you're having a hard time with that still, keeping it simple, think about the things that would have the most meaning for you. The reason I share the quotes that I share with you, like, I'm here, my heart goes out to you, is because those are the words that I personally would love to hear. You might have other words that hold meaning for you, but just know that if they're special to you, chances are they will have special meaning to the recipient. So that is step number 8. Keep it simple. So just as a quick review on those tips for supporting someone in stages of grief. So tip number 1, use your voice. Tip number 2, send a digital card. Number 3, make music your gift. Tip number 4, dig up the photos, share those with the family and tell them about the stories behind those images. Number 5, use the online condolences book. Number 6, feed them. Number 7, calendarize connection. Make sure that your support is felt long after the immediate loss. And tip number 8, keep it simple. Use words that resonate with you. Don't overthink it. Don't fall into the trap of, I just don't know what to say. Because there's always something that can be said. Expressing that you're there for someone is a healing thing to do on both sides of things. So I'm going to wrap this up because there's not a lot more to be said. I don't want to get into the science of grief. I think that if you take the time to research grief, if you're in this phase of life right now, I think it's really important to connect with some research for sure, but I think it's even more important for you to connect with experts who will help you move through some of the stages. And by move through, I do not mean rush through and, move through all of the stages quicker. What I mean is find someone that will help you bring the feelings to the surface so that they can be dissolved. That's a powerful act of healing and a beautiful way to approach your overall health and wellness. It's not only for you when you take these healing steps, it's for all of the people around you as well. It's hard to watch other people hurt, and the work that you invest in healing has a ripple effect. So for anyone who has experienced loss, especially during this bizarre time that we find ourselves in, I feel you. I'm someone who, like I said in the beginning, I require that sense of closure that often comes with visitations and funerals and lots of hugs and stories of the person gone. But That's not happening right now. So hopefully these tips have offered you a little bit of insight on how you can still create that sense of closure for yourself and for the person who has experienced the loss maybe more intimately. I know that, as we pivot in new times, I feel certain. I really do. I feel certain that our ability to express our hearts is only going to find new ways to show up, because as people, as deeply caring humans, I know that that is something that we all wish for and we all wish to give. So expressing our hearts, like I said, will always find new ways to show up. Thank you guys for listening. I think grief is a topic that it's important to chat about. So thanks for hanging out with me today. As always, know that I appreciate you sharing your time with me. I know that time is the only non-renewable resource. So the fact that you chose to spend some of it with me is truly a great honor. I would ask that if you found some value in today's episode, certainly rate, subscribe, and if you feel inclined to do so, share it. Share it with a friend. Post it somewhere where someone else can have access to the 8 tips. You never know. One of these pieces of information, a little bit of wisdom here and there can really make an impact for someone. So thank you guys all for being with me. I'll look forward to connecting with you again on the Planting Wildflowers podcast. Well, that's a wrap for today's episode, friends. Thank you for hanging out with us here at the Planting Wildflowers podcast. We'll look forward to seeing you again real soon. And in the meantime, if you would be so kind as to rate, subscribe, and share this podcast with others, I'd be most grateful. We'll catch you again soon. Until then, take good care.